Good morning and welcome to the Takeaways podcast. On today's episode, I'm with Ntsako, and he's the co-founder of the Darkies in Tech, which is a community that aims to really spotlight people of color who are building tech in South Africa. So on today's episode, I'm going to pick his brain on what the community is really trying to achieve and get his thoughts on the overall state of people of color who are trying to build in South Africa. Hi Ntsako, good morning man, and welcome to the Takeaways podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Ephraim, thank you so much for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. I'm super excited to speak to you today, and I hope that there's some interesting takeaways for your audience.
So let's start first with the community, right? Can you just give me a timeline of when you decided to start the Darkies in Tech community and what exactly you're trying to achieve with it?
So I started Darkies in Tech in February 2021. Interestingly, this happens to be our 5-year anniversary. I often tell the story that I started Darkies in Tech out of a moment of frustration, and that is true. So at the time when I started the community, I had already been working on my first tech startup for, I think it was a period of 6 to 7 years at that time. And in the journey of building that business, I remember constantly feeling frustrated that oftentimes the real rooms where the needle was being pushed, where high quality knowledge was being shared, where deals were being done, we were oftentimes the only people of color in those rooms, right? And you can imagine, at the time I was building a township-based tech company that sought to democratize access to security. So I'm spending most of my time in the days in the township, in homes, in community meetings, learning about these challenges and the deficits that characterize people's lived experiences. And in the nighttime, I'm in these very prestigious spaces where high quality knowledge, network, and capital is flowing, and our people are not in those rooms. So it was a growing concern in me that, unless there's something that's done, the tech opportunity is going to land squarely and disproportionately in the laps of one people group, being our white counterparts. But the other thing that I think sat as a frustration for me was that, I knew that there were other tech entrepreneurs around the country who looked like me, who were building these incredible businesses. And the shame and missed opportunity was that the only time we ever came together was when we were competing against each other for resources, right? So in some spaces, resources are flowing freely. In others, resources are highly contested. And the framing is adversarial and it doesn't lend itself to collaboration and really the spirit of Ubuntu. So I felt like that was a missed opportunity. And there needed to be something in the ecosystem that exists that would unify people of color, create a safe space for us to have conversations about the systemic challenges within the ecosystem without being painted to seem as though we're complaining, right? But to have honest conversations about these are the challenges that exist, these are the trust deficits that exist, how do we navigate that as people of color? And that is essentially what we sought out to build. I'll be honest with you, Ephraim, that this wasn't also clear with me when I started the community, right? A lot of it was just thinking about what the next step should be. And I knew that once you brought the right people into the room, there would be some sort of a magic that it happens, but I wasn't entirely sure what that would be. I mean, today, now that we've gone through a 5-year journey of building alongside these entrepreneurs, growing and ultimately becoming the largest vetted network for people of color in tech, it's a lot easier for me to articulate our vision, our mission, and all of that. But it wasn't like that in the beginning. But today I can say with a high level of clarity that our North Star is to democratize the tech opportunity. So what I mean by that is that we want to make it so that Black founders have got equal access to opportunities, right? But deserving Black founders have equal access to opportunity. So that's how we're democratizing there on that front. And that opportunity speaks to fundraising, market access, and the like. But on the other end, there's also investors, right? And that's often the piece that people don't talk about, right? Is the systemic exclusion that Black emerging fund managers experience. They oftentimes navigate the ecosystem very similarly to Black tech entrepreneurs. So we've opened our doors to them, and we're constantly thinking about how do we democratize the tech opportunity for them, ensuring that they can raise the funds that they need to back investors. And the same is true even for career professionals, right? They're not necessarily directly involved in the ecosystem, but a lot of them want to on-ramp onto tech. A lot of them want to become angel investors, but they don't have that platform where they can find really deserving, excellent Black tech entrepreneurs to support. And we want to be that ecosystem enabler that brings all of these people together, solves for the trust through high quality vetting and walking a journey with these entrepreneurs to ensure that this opportunity can be enjoyed by all people of color and not just our white counterparts.
In the course of the half a decade that the community has been around, what would you say has changed compared to how the lack of the access was in 2021 to how it is now in 2026?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So some things have changed, some things have unfortunately stayed the same. I think one thing that has definitely changed in the ecosystem is that now there's a lot more collaborative action. And I think we have a significant role to play because now we have entrepreneurs who are more aware of the other entrepreneurs who are building in the ecosystem, whether it be in their sector or in another sector. But our members are constantly meeting up and they're constantly sharing insights and trying to find ways to collaborate, right? I'm very proud because last week at the Qatar Web Summit, 2 of our members bumped into each other and they took a very beautiful picture. And I think it was just a picture of just the importance of community in kind of making the world a smaller place, a global village of sorts. And I think it was very powerful for me because when I think about my journey when I was building my tech startup, Jonga, something like that would not have been possible. So I really think that we are positively enabling the level of connectedness in the ecosystem, and that is going to lead to positive outcomes. The other thing that I think has changed is that we've seen that there's a general acknowledgement by the ecosystem at large and even government that tech needs to be transformed. Now, it's still early days in terms of efforts around that transformation and ensuring that some of these programs and incentivizers are tailored to be more inclusive, but the conversation has gotten going. And we're oftentimes invited into these conversations around how we actually adjust and make these incentives and programs more suitable for diverse founder sets. So we're in those conversations, and that's why I can attest to this. And I'm talking about government agencies locally and the like. And we're also seeing as well that, the corporates are, whether or not they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart or because, they are mandated to do it, there is generally an acknowledgement that, transformation in the supply chains, diversification along the lines of enterprise development and supplier development is becoming more and more of a topical theme. This is something that we're looking to support, right, through ensuring that these stakeholders have access to vetted Black tech entrepreneurs that come from our network. And we're oftentimes engaging with these people and trying to open up market access to solve the problem for the entrepreneur who might not necessarily have the trusted relationships among decision makers within the relevant corporates, but also on the corporate side, which is mandated to support and transform. And we're trying to play the role in between. So that's definitely changed. In terms of the flow of capital, which I think is probably a big theme on everyone's mind, is there more investment landing in the hands of Black tech entrepreneurs? I can't conclusively say that that's happening yet. And I think that's part of the work that I think still needs to happen in the ecosystem. And I think it's 2 parts. I think of it in 2 parts. One, it's about trying to bridge the trust deficit and unconscious bias that exists between white fund managers and Black tech entrepreneurs. But also it's about ensuring that we make it easier for emerging Black fund managers to also on-ramp into VC. And we're thinking about how do we actually play a role along both of those fronts. I'm very encouraged by the fact that oftentimes when we reach out to white VCs to organize office hours with our entrepreneurs, the reception has been warmly received. But we haven't yet seen that translate to actual deals being done and that being fed back to us. But what it has showcased is that there's a maturing in the ecosystem, and the broader ecosystem is realizing that in order for the tech opportunity in South Africa to be viable, then it needs more inclusivity and more players playing the game at the highest level. And I think that I've been encouraged by that response from some of the partners that we've engaged with. I think there's still a lot more work to be done on the second stream around ensuring that the barriers to entry as a fund manager, as a Black fund manager, are lowered further. And it's not to say you bring the bar all the way down, but it's just to say you have to understand that by virtue of people's lived experiences, there are certain aspects and requirements that don't come by easy. And therefore you have to think of how do we solve for these? to ensure that we can have more black emerging fund managers. And the reason why that is important is because at the end of the day, a deal is a human endeavor, right? It's one human across the table from another. And whether we like it or not, trust plays a huge role, right, in terms of unlocking the flow of capital. If an investor looks across the table and sees himself in the entrepreneur, can see that we have a similar lived experience, I can tell that, I feel like I know this person, then that increases the likelihood of a deal being done. And that's why you can get two Bishop's boys or two Michael House boys sitting across the table from each other, and they're like, we pretty much have a shared lived experience, which means that that's a proxy for, I know your values, I know your work ethic, and all of those things are de-risked instantly. That is a challenge that we're trying to solve for, is that if investors don't look like us, then we're not going to have that moment where you look across the table and say, I feel like I know and I can trust this person. And we have to solve for that.
Just to track back a bit, right? I'm trying to understand the root cause of the problem. Why do, people of color not get like as much of the funding? Can you just expand more on that? Because you touched on it by saying, we have to have like a similar experience, right? So if it's a person of color on the other side and a white person on the other side, there's a little bit of a disconnect there. So just try to expand more on that, on what causes that, and how do we try to solve for that?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So, you have to, and I tell the entrepreneurs in Darkies and Tech this often, you have to think about it from the investor's perspective, right? As you approach the deal table. How are they approaching the conversation and what are they looking out for? Because these are the things that you effectively have to solve for, right? In the shortest time possible, to establish a connection, a human connection that can ultimately lead to trust or a proxy for trust, and that can help you get the deal done, right? So what that means is that you need to think about what are the risks that are they flagged in their mind, right? And of course, this varies depending on the stage. But let's just focus on the early stage, for instance, where it's commonly understood that as an investor, you're backing the jockey. This is where I think people of color are disproportionately disadvantaged. Because if you're backing the jockey, and the jockey doesn't look like you don't know what the jockey values, you don't know if the jockey is a good steward, there's a whole lot of alarm bells that go off and a lot more validation that needs to be done to bridge that gap and understand the lived experience. And I think to make matters worse, a lot of the aspects of the black lived experience are not necessarily valued as a premium in the positive sense. And to give you a concrete example of that, as a black person navigating life, you typically have to demonstrate a lot of grit. But in the deal-making process, that grit is not necessarily seen as an increased likelihood of success in entrepreneurship. And it actually is. It contributes. By virtue of having taken the risk, foregoing a corporate salary, foregoing your responsibility to actually oftentimes contribute at home, to pursue this venture and take this risk with your life and your career, that is something that should be appraised in favor of the entrepreneur, right? And I feel like there are some of those signals that are currently misinterpreted and not appropriately appraised, right? So misaligned appraisal of the value of the traits that an entrepreneur of color demonstrates is a part and parcel of this problem, right? So we need to then start to celebrate and speak up these traits and draw the connection that this actually increases the likelihood of success, right? That is extremely important. And I think this is storytelling. And this is a big component of what we're trying to do in Darkies and Tech, is to actually champion the wins of these entrepreneurs, highlight the fact that the characteristics that they're showing are actually factors that increase the likelihood of success. And the more widely understood that becomes, the more that when the more action we will see when the two counterparts sit across the table. It's not like the lived experience is being discounted, but it's actually being properly appraised, right? I think that this, for me, is probably the biggest point. And it's not limited to just investment. It's even limited to access to talent, right? The same values that people of color entrepreneurs, as I'm seeing it, are demonstrating, are supposed to be signals that give confidence to the talent market. That if I work for an entrepreneur like this, then I know that we are following the leadership of a leader who has demonstrated grit, perseverance, has made the sacrifice, all of the things that I believe should give confidence to talent as well. But it's all about storytelling at the end of the day, and I think it is going to take a bit of time, but I think it's necessary.
Over the course of 2024 and 2025, there was a pushback on these DEI initiatives, and I think it has spilled from just tech in the US to tech in South Africa, where the argument by other people is that we are not backing these funders because they are white. We are backing them because they happen to be white, but they suit what we are trying to back, right? But the truth is that, because of the history of the country and all that, you see that a majority of the funders who fit that kind of the model that a lot of investors are trying to back do happen to be white. How do you address that? In that, do you agree that DEI doesn't have a role to play, that like an investor is going to back an entrepreneur because they're good and not because they happen to be good and white also? How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question that you're posing, Ephraim, and I think it's something I reflect on often. I think to say that we only back those that are ready today, meet all of our criteria is a very short-sighted approach, right? Because ultimately, in order for the tech business model to work, we need more entrepreneurs succeeding, right? So I think it's very close-minded in the sense that it almost removes oneself from the responsibility to help shape and develop that pipeline to be diverse and to be ready. You and I both know that there are certain systemic disadvantages by virtue of our legacy as South Africa, as a country, that not only but that has less of an impact on our ability to show up as good founders, but more to do with uncontrollables like a lack of network within corporate with decision makers, because we don't necessarily have friends and family that are decision makers. This is not everyone's experience, but it's by and large the typical experience of a black person, right? Same with investment flows, right? Investors and VCs. We know that a lot of the times the modus operandi is warm intros over anything else. So these are some of the uncontrollables that have nothing to do with the quality of the entrepreneur, but have everything to do with systemic advantages, right? So I think to then write off and say, well, DEI is irrelevant and will only back the entrepreneurs that we think meet our criteria today, well, good luck, because you're not going to have the pipeline you need to sustain your own business model tomorrow, right? And I used to wonder, are there any validity to the claims that, then where are all the good black entrepreneurs? Are they there? Is there anyone out there building good ventures? I used to wonder, is there validity to that? But now, in building Darkies and Tech over the past 5 years, I've actually realized that there are hundreds of black tech entrepreneurs. In fact, I recently heard a stat about the number of tech entrepreneurs in our ecosystem. And I thought to myself, this can't be true, because in our ecosystem alone, we have more than this. So I walked away with the realization that it's either this is completely false or we are the ecosystem, right? So whatever claims that are being made about the fact that there aren't any good entrepreneurs or whatever, I encourage you to reach out to me. And I will share my details at the end of this, and let's have a conversation, because we have got many entrepreneurs in our network across all stages of the venture life cycle, right from pre-seed all the way to a unicorn. So I no longer buy the excuse that where are these black entrepreneurs? They're not ready and so forth. No. As for quality, I can confidently defend the quality of the entrepreneurs that we have in our community. It's a matter of how do we then, as an ecosystem, identify the role we need to play to ensure that, whatever it is that is an uncontrollable in one's entrepreneurial journey, on the basis of systemic exclusion, that needs to be dealt with. And no one can absolve themselves from this. And not necessarily just from a pure activistic standpoint, but in terms of ensuring the long-term viability of your own business. This should be something you think about.
What do you think is the risk that we run by having undiversified ecosystem pool, right? I mean, it cannot be a good thing that a majority of the funders who get capital to scale are a demographic that's just there, right? What risk do we, face by not having, like a diverse ecosystem pool?
Yeah, we run a major risk, hey? And this is something that I try and communicate to the Darkies and tech entrepreneurs, is that, guys, it's so important that we have more success stories in our ecosystem, because if we don't have black tech entrepreneurs returning capital, capital will always go where it is best treated, right? So currently what our argument is that there's unconscious and systemic biases within the ecosystem. But we have the opportunity to falsify that through data. But if we don't succeed in our ventures, we then create data that then justifies those racist biases. So the stakes are very high. And I always make it a point to highlight that and say, guys, if there is a high potential black tech venture in this country, let's champion their success. Let's share their wins. Let's amplify these things, because it's not always a guarantee that they know the right person in the media, publication or whatever that can help them create those signals that can attract more capital. So let's play that role ourselves and create that ecosystem ourselves. Let's ensure that we're supporting. Let's ensure that where it makes sense for our businesses, let's adopt their products and let's give them high quality feedback. And we've even curated spaces where we can give ourselves feedback, right? Not only at the mature and scaling venture stage, but even at the early stages. There are forums that exist within the Darkies and Tech ecosystem where we can give ourselves high quality feedback, where we can hold each other accountable, because when you join, it is then understood that you're not only representing yourself, but you're also representing the standard and excellence of a Darkies and Tech venture. So I hope that answers the question, but the stakes are incredibly high, and we want to see more of these successes happening, and it's only going to come from us adopting one another's products, giving each other high quality feedback, and endorsing each other.
I want to get your thoughts on this, right? In Kenya, at the height of the cycle in 2021, 2022, a lot of the white founders got a lot of funding to build products which were tailored towards people in rural areas, etc., etc. The problem that caused then was that because a founder does not have a lived experience to be able to solve that particular problem, in 2024, when the funding went down, those startups had to close shop, because as an entrepreneur, you have to try to solve a problem that really, really deep down, right? And if you are a white founder and you're trying to solve an e-commerce problem for spaza shops in the township, you don't have that experience of being in the township, right? So you won't be able to solve that problem to the best extent, right? So I think that's another issue that's caused by this lack of funding for the founders of color, because they know these problems, so they can be able to address them better, right?
Yes, and that's a huge component of the narrative that I share when I'm talking to government and when I'm talking to corporate as well, and just general backers of the ecosystem, is to say that when you support a tech entrepreneur, you're supporting somebody who is trying to create economic value through building a business, creating jobs and so forth. But because of the fact that they are who they are likely solving an issue that, has some sort of a social or socio-economic component or aspect, right? You're not going to have just frivolous solutions that don't quite move the needle forward, but you're going to have core infrastructural challenges such as logistics, food security, these really fundamental problems and these wicked problems that plague the continent. It's not necessarily the case for everyone. I'm not going to say all of the entrepreneurs in our network are building such businesses, but a lot of them are. And that is because of the proximity and empathy that our people have towards the problems that their people experience, or they experience, or their loved ones experience, right? So I think that is why we need to support entrepreneurs of color in particular, is because as a byproduct, you're also getting social issues addressed, but not at the surface level, to your point, at a level that is far deeper, right? Because they oftentimes are immersed in this world, right? For me, when I started my first tech company, Jonga, I was trying to solve for the issue of security, or the lack of security in township communities. Why? Because I know that a good 80% of my family still lives in townships. And unless someone solves the problem, they're all vulnerable. that is a connection to the problem that I think you cannot fake. There's a certain energy that gives you, right? There's a certain sense of responsibility that gives you to build something that not only enriches you, but also benefits the community more broadly. That's not to say, as a white person, you can't try and solve these problems. But it is to say that it requires a great deal of empathy, humility, and understanding how to navigate those spaces to deliver something that has long-lasting value and is not extractive, right? I'm very glad that the typical person in a township today is starting to become more aware of extractive relationships with brands. I don't have the data that suggests that we're seeing changes in spending behavior, but I think there's an overall genuine skepticism around propositions that are masquerading as value adds, but actually are extracting value from like vulnerable markets such as the rurals and the townships. I think what's happening in Kenya is very sad, and I've been speaking to people in my network who are from the Kenyan ecosystem, and they've attested to the fact that unless you've got an American or a European white co-founder, accessing capital is near impossible, even in their own markets. And that's not how the ecosystem should be structured. In fact, for me, that really tempts me to launch Darkies in Tech Kenya, because that's the kind of systemic inequalities and injustices that I think necessitate an intervention such as Darkies in Tech.
Whilst we're still on that, right? I mean, we can hope that the ecosystem can be able to figure this problem out on its own. But I think at some point we're going to need the regulations which are going to enforce this to happen, right? Where do you think we are at the moment in terms of the regulations that's going to try to address this challenge?
Yeah, no, it's difficult to say. I mean, policy is not necessarily a strong point for me as an individual. I always try and solve for that through ensuring we've got proper relations with the likes of the SA Startup Act movement, and we actually have a representative in our team as well that looks into these matters. But I can say that I've been encouraged by the fact that the conversations that I've been roped into around ecosystem support, entrepreneurial development support, have highlighted to me that there is indeed an understanding and an appreciation of the fact that policy needs to be amended and in some instances written, right, that appreciates and highlights the nuances between a tech startup and an SME, right? And I think that's extremely important because I think maybe let me say it this way. It's extremely important because the two, although are early stage businesses, and they have that in common, they're very nuanced in terms of their job impact, especially in the early stage. Very nuanced in terms of their burn profile. Very nuanced along a variety of lines, right? And a gospel that I've been preaching whenever I'm presented with a platform is the fact that these differences are very significant if you are such a person who endeavors to support them. And there's a nice proverb that I've come across that I've cited on numerous occasions, that if you try and assess the intelligence of a fish by how well it can climb a tree, you will wrongfully classify it as incompetent, right? You should judge a fish's competence by how well it swims, not by how well it climbs a tree. So I try and draw parallel to this proverb to what is happening in the current ecosystem of trying to clump SMEs and tech startups within the same pool, right? And I think so far it feels like it's getting the message across that, one, we need to understand the distinction between the two if we want to better support them. So I think that in the next 5 years, we will see a lot more progress, and we will participate in that progress to ensure that there is generally a widely understood definition of what a tech startup is and the kind of support it requires, and that there will also be an acknowledgement and appreciation of the unique, challenging and extenuating circumstances that affect Black people endeavoring to build this kind of business.
A lot of the times when we look at this problem, I think we tend to look at it a lot from the eyes of the founders, right? But I'm happy that the Darkies in Tech community is not just the founders. We have fund managers, talent people who are working tech. Can you just share more on the challenges that those people face? Because I think the ones that the founders face, we know them a lot because they're, right there. Share more on the challenges faced by other people.
Yeah, I think, when you look at the entrepreneurial side of the spectrum, on the investor side of the spectrum, I always tell founders, you'll be surprised how similar the journeys are between a black tech entrepreneur and a black fund manager, right? You're both are having to go out there and raise capital, right? So a lot of those skills are actually transferable. And it's then no surprise that you hear things like the best investors are ex-entrepreneurs and the best entrepreneurs are ex-investors. It's because a lot of those skills are actually transferable. What oftentimes is missing is kind of the empathy that you can only get from having actually been in the shoes of the other role player. But a lot of those skills are transferable in the sense that as an emerging black fund manager, you oftentimes don't have the social capital that is required to really raise what you need to raise. Those same trust deficits prevail around, we're not quite sure if you are a good enough of a steward of this capital for us to give you what you're asking for. So you'll ask for X, you get half of X, but still get expected to shoot the lights out and give a return, right? Sounds like the constraints of black tech entrepreneur experiences. As well, the VC business model is extremely challenging, right? In terms of how you commercialize and make a return, personal return from that business model is extremely difficult. It actually incentivizes VCs to raise more capital than they might even need to actually deploy and solve whatever problem they're identifying or gap they're identifying. And you can imagine that constraint. If you need more capital to make the business model work and you're constantly entrusted with less capital than you need, then you're almost set up for failure for day one. I think black tech entrepreneurs can almost relate with that sentiment of needing X, getting half of X, but being expected to return 2X or whatever X. So I feel like those dynamics are oftentimes the same. It's just a matter of which game do you have an appetite or are you uniquely positioned to play. But if you ask me, there's more similarities than there are differences. And my encouragement is for entrepreneurs to spend more time understanding investors, right? And this is why there's so much wisdom in the advice that says, meet investors before you need to raise capital and have a conversation with them and understand, like, what are they looking for, right? What are the constraints that have been imposed on them by their investors? And how can you help them to solve for that? And I think you'll be a little bit more, there'll be a higher sense of responsibility when you take the money. And I think that we're seeing the consequences across the continent of entrepreneurs who don't have an appreciation for the significance of a moment when they receive capital and what that means and the duty to return it. And I think that stems from a lack of empathy around the challenges of the person who is backing you. And vice versa, right? I think I also want to balance that and say, if you're an investor hearing this and thinking, yeah, I've been sorely misunderstood, I want you to also recognize the fact that despite the fact that you bring capital to the partner, it truly is the entrepreneur who takes the biggest risk with their life because they could be anywhere else. So I think if there's a healthy respect and appreciation for both roles and the constraints that are being imposed, we can work together as a partnership and increase the likelihood that we return capital. And it will be less about, us versus them, but it's about how we actually build the ecosystem together.
And that brings me to the next, topic of discussion, and that's the value of community. It's hard to be an entrepreneur, right? But being a black entrepreneur is like 10 times, 100 times tougher. What role do you think that community that, the Darkies in Tech creates, how does it contribute towards like ensuring that our founders don't feel like I'm just on my own here, I have 4 stone walls around me? What role does that play to give them that kind of push and motivation to keep going?
So I think, first of all, I want to speak about the value of community more broadly, right? I think we are an example or an instance of community, but there are so many communities out there. And, oftentimes I get asked, are you threatened by the emergence of a new community? And my answer to that is always no, right? Like, there are supposed to be multiple communities out there, value and interest-based communities out there. And as an entrepreneur, you have the right to decide who you align with and and to what you give your allegiance based on what you value and what you're interested in, right? And the reason why that's important is because it's good to know that you're not the only person who's going on this journey. And that's a huge determinant of failure, actually, is the loneliness associated with the journey, the overwhelm that comes with not knowing what you don't know and not having anyone in your immediate circle who can answer some of the questions you have based on lived experience and hard-won insights. So when I see communities popping up, I get excited because I know then that there's probably going to be a place for someone who's looking at the DIT website and thinking, that doesn't quite resonate with me, right? They shouldn't necessarily fall through the cracks. There should be a space that exists where they can access the same benefit of community, right? It's not to say I believe in all communities. I think some communities might not necessarily have the right heart and are here because of the fact that the community is the newest flavor and is the latest, fun thing to do. But the ones that are well-intentioned and are really seeking the welfare and the equal access and, just love their people whom they are passionate about supporting. Those are the ones that I think more of them should exist in the ecosystem. And, for us to speak more broadly about Darkies in Tech, one, we want to solve for that loneliness aspect that I think is uniquely intensified as a person of color by virtue of the massive risk you've taken that might sometimes even isolate you from your family, right? And sometimes might make you seem extremely irresponsible to others around you until such a day where you actually are able to make a return, right? Fingers crossed. That is uniquely African, that problem, right? That risk associated with, I'm not going to work for a corporate and then be contributing to a building project back at home is uniquely a Black African experience. And we can't lie about that. So being put in a space where you realize you're not crazy because others are on a similar journey, others have paid a similar price and they are building their ventures is extremely important. I can't discount the value that has on the psyche of an entrepreneur, right, in terms of their ability to execute and build their business. But beyond that, we, in doing life with these entrepreneurs over the course of 5 years, have learned that there's actually other problems, right, of course. And we've codified these problems and we call them the access gaps. So access to community is the gap we've been discussing, but there's also the access to knowledge, right? Oftentimes as a Black tech entrepreneur, you're a first generation entrepreneur in your family, right? So which means that there's a lot of knowledge gaps. And it doesn't mean you're not a high potential operator or anything. It's just that you don't know what you don't know. And we try and solve that through a variety of event formats, which we call knowledge transfer sessions, which is our fancy term for master classes. Then there's the access to funding gap as well that we try and solve. We're not yet in the position where we can actively write investments ourselves, but this is why we've wanted to bring their fund managers closer so that we can create those forums where they can engage. And we put the fund managers in DIT to work. Every month we ask them to host a group office hours where they will unpack their fund mandate, give details that might otherwise be difficult to ascertain from their websites, right? So that's a very important initiative. But beyond that, we're also thinking about how do we actually ensure that career professionals that have a desire to support deserving Black-owned tech companies have an interface with our entrepreneurs and are able to contribute in the form of angel investments. It's something that we're thinking about and we're hoping to launch this year. And that solves the access to funding gap. And then, of course, there's the access to market gap, recognizing that our entrepreneurs don't oftentimes have that decision-making friend or family member. We want to leverage the collective impact of Darkies in Tech to get them in the right rooms, right? When an entrepreneur is having a conversation with, let's say, for instance, Standard Bank, they come in the name of their own traction in whatever credibility they have. Oftentimes, it's not enough. But when we come as Darkies in Tech and say we represent a community that has collectively created north of 4,000 jobs and has collectively raised more than 5.9 billion rand in funding, that's a completely new conversation. And that is what we try and do to help them bridge that market to access gap. So that is the value of community, is that you then are able to get the benefit of our shared impact in getting into the right rooms.
I was about to touch on that in terms of the access to funding. I feel like the angel investments and the pension funds, can really play like a really big role in trying to drive the mission of funding people of color to build these tech startups, right?
So spot on. And I think, not to disempower VCs and the role they play in the ecosystem, but I think there's been a critical reliance on VC funding that has not quite lived up to expectations, right? And this is no shot on any VCs because once again, we empathize actively with the challenges of running that business model, right? But I do think that as an entrepreneur, you need to be aware of all the different options that are available to you. And to your point, I do think pension funds have a huge role to play in terms of catalyzing the ecosystem, not only by equipping just the VCs that make later stage investments, but what portion of that can we cordon off for actually developing the pipeline of tomorrow that ensures the sustainability of this particular asset class into the future, right? But the one that I find myself being most excited about is actually working with career professionals who earn bonuses and they're not too sure what to do with them, right? This is the one that excites me because it in the true sense, I think can unlock our mission of democratizing the tech opportunity for the entrepreneur, yes, but also for the career professional who wants exposure, but oftentimes doesn't necessarily know how to vet, how to structure the deal. And we can bring that knowledge and the best practices from the ecosystem. We bring our vetting and the data we collect on from these entrepreneurs to ensure that we can make this asset class available even for a black person in a corporate job. That for me is like the perfect story. And I think it keeps everyone on their toes because the more options an entrepreneur has in building their business, the more everyone acts right because now there's a bit of competition, right? And I think that is, for me, is where I think, and maybe this is a hot take, right? And that this is where I think the future of capital on the continent lies. Because we do have enough career professionals that can spare 20,000, 50,000, 100,000. And if we can pool this and really, be diligent in our approach, vet, continue to capture data, match people to people who have deep industry expertise within the corporates or the government departments that they work, then you've got real strategic investment and strategic capital. Not just, I have the largest fund, but I have money, I've contributed to a pool, but I have the ear of a decision maker in the same corporate that I know you're wanting to buy and sell into. That, I think, for me is a lot more powerful.
And also, I think impact investing goes beyond just trying to back a shiny startup because it has AI on its pitch deck, right? You are contributing towards trying to solve a problem that you see every single day. So I think, it contributes a lot to you being able to solve problems that are there. Like, you can see them every single day, right?
Yeah, spot on. And that's the beauty of people investing in industries that they're already active participants in, right? Like they understand the nuances of the problem statements, the problem spaces very well. And that's the kind of investor you want. You never really just want an investor that can give you money. The reason why entrepreneurs oftentimes take capital like that is because they're not spoiled for choice. If you get a term sheet, you sign it and you build your business, all right? Or at least that's the advice.
I imagine you've been trying to raise for 2.5 years. You finally have a term sheet, but the terms are just terrible. You're like, do I want to do this for 2.5 years again, man? Do I?
Yep. So it's slim pickings, right? And what that means is that the dynamic is then in favor of the investor. But I remember the wise words that Mr. Kanye Makubela, who runs a fund in the United States, South African from Soweto, running one of the largest funds in the United States. He did a session with the Darkies in tech community. I think it was back in 2024 or 2023. And he said that if you get on a plane as an entrepreneur, try and create as much options as possible. And he mentioned that even as an investor in the Silicon Valley ecosystem, they're not exempt from sometimes having to catch a plane to China, raising the capital that they need and coming back to that ecosystem. So for us, it was all shocking because we were like, but you're in Silicon Valley, surely that you'll get the capital that you need, right? And it wasn't the case. So my advice to entrepreneurs as well is then, in an environment where there's such constraint, yes, you have to take what you're given. But the real trick comes in unlocking more options for yourself, whether that be traveling to a new ecosystem or what we're trying to do, which is trying to unlock capital from those career professionals. My hope is that it's going to give a little bit more power to the entrepreneur.
It's been half a decade of the Darkies in tech, right? What's the roadmap in terms of the next half a decade?
For us, it's going to be about democratizing the tech opportunity, ensuring that, entrepreneurs get access to the opportunities that can help them push the needle forward. So what that will look like is, in a way, helping the entrepreneur to defend their focus. So being a pathfinder, connecting them to the right opportunities, the right funders, but protecting them from the wrong ones, which we know exist in our ecosystem, right? So that's also very important, because a lot of carnage is created when you've got programs that are more extractive, that don't move the needle forward, and sometimes even kill the startups, right? Because of misaligned incentives to create jobs prematurely and things like that. So one, we're gonna be a pathfinder, and we're gonna be honest with our entrepreneurs around who we think they should work with and who they should not. Ultimately, the choice is theirs, but we're gonna make those connections to the right partners, and we think that's gonna help them. On the investor side, we've been offering a service which we call venture sourcing, and we're gonna continue to advertise that. And essentially, what we're doing there is we're trying to help those investors that say, where are the good black entrepreneurs, to connect them to them. Right? So if you're looking to diversify your program, your portfolio with deserving, vetted entrepreneurs, we want to speak to you, right? And we want to provide that pipeline so that, you have no more excuses for not backing tech entrepreneurs, right? And it's not to say everyone's making excuses, but we want to eliminate that as a reason why your portfolio is not diversified. And then for the career professionals, you can hear I'm extremely excited about these people, because I'm genuinely seeing a desire and an interest to get closer to the tech fire, right? And you're going to probably see that in the fact that events like the Startup Club, a lot of the people who are in attendance are career professionals, right? They are entrepreneurs, yes, but there's also career professionals. And I'm sure even in your own newsletter, a good portion of your listenership is probably career professionals. And this is because there's a genuine hunger and a desire to get close to the fire and to support. Right, to support local, to support people of color and the like. So I really see a huge opportunity in the next decade in us really organizing that, making it safe and secure to facilitate capital flows. And then maybe we won't rely so much on people who are insistent on their biases and their lack of transformation. And maybe we can bypass them entirely and still build successful stories and black-led ventures in the ecosystem. And then final point, I think very important, I kind of alluded to it in our conversation around Kenya, is that I genuinely think that we're not the only country in the continent that struggles with this dynamic, right? So we're still thinking through what might that look like. We don't necessarily have ambitions to be in every African continent. That isn't the approach we're taking. We want to take a very thoughtful and considered approach. In ecosystems where we're seeing this kind of systemic exclusion on the grounds of local versus international, white versus black, these are the regions and the territories where we want to partner with credible entrepreneurs who can help us get a presence and already start to support these entrepreneurs that fall outside of these trust networks. So that's another thing that I'm extremely passionate and excited about.
To close off, right, if there is one tip that you can give to a person of color who's starting a startup, perhaps they just, started from varsity, what's that piece of advice you can give them? They are confused. They are just seeing, like a sea of people who don't look like them. They are trying to raise funding. They are not. What's that piece of advice you can give them?
My advice to all entrepreneurs building on the continent is focus on your customer. Build something your customer wants, not what investors want. Because I think that tends to also, that's a dynamic that is very prevalent in our ecosystem. As people building in spaces they don't care about, they've got no lived experience or advantages in, but because of the fact that it's what is raising on the continent, people are building in those spaces, and it's just adding another solution to already long line or a sea of solutions. And I really like a LinkedIn post that Mr. Ian Aboyeji, from Future Africa, Flutterwave and the like, he recently commented on this around the importance of solving for problems that are real on the continent and people whom are real on the continent. So that is advice that I give across the board. But to a person of color listening to this, what I would tell them is that, find people whom, you align with. And this speaks to the importance of community. Right? You can try and do it alone, but you're not going to have enough time to learn all of the school fees. Why? Because, to be fair, you don't have as many attempts at the target as your white counterparts. Not to say all white people have got these advantages, but by large, right? We're talking about this by large. You don't necessarily have the safety net. You have more pressures to get this right. So because of that, work smart, right? Align with people on a similar mission to you. Try and learn from their experiences, their mistakes, so that the limited resources you have, you can stretch them as far as possible to give you enough attempts on target to iterate your way to something that the market adopts. And if you can do that and focus on those principles, those first principles, and attract the right talent, I think you can overcome even the systemic demons that we face on the continent and build a successful company.
It's been a pleasure, Ntsako. I think it's great work that you and the team are doing to Darkies in Tech. I think this is a conversation that we don't really see a lot on your LinkedIn, etc., because it's a really uncomfortable conversation. So it's been a pleasure talking to you about it and getting to know, the insights of the mission that you're trying to drive. And I wish you and the team all the best in the future, man.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ephraim, for the platform and for the invitation. I've thoroughly enjoyed engaging with you, and my sincere hope is that people for whom my message resonated, or maybe people who disagree with my points, let's engage. I think that is the only way that the ecosystem develops, is when we get to understand different perspectives and come up with an approach that ultimately is in the interest and the benefit of the broader ecosystem. I'm very open to engaging, even on public platforms, about this topic, because I'm very passionate about it. I believe that there are excellent entrepreneurs on the continent. It's widely said that South Africa's greatest import are its people, but that's not just white people who are immigrating, it's even people of color. And I think that the role that we play and we continue to play is going to be to highlight that and champion that success. But it's my long-winded way of saying thank you.
Great, man. I appreciate you and have a great day, man.